Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into a conflict that dramatically reshaped North America, yet often gets just a brief mention in history class: the Mexican-American War. You might have heard of the Alamo or the phrase manifest destiny, but there's so much more to this story of ambition, betrayal, and consequences that still resonate today. This wasn't just a simple land grab. It was a defining moment that forged the modern United States. And understanding it is key to understanding the complex relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. So, stick around as we uncover what your history books probably left out. Let's set the stage. The year is 1845. The United States, fueled by an idea called manifest destiny, believed it was its God-given right to expand westward, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This ideology wasn't just a political slogan. It was a powerful cultural force driving American policy. The recent annexation of the Republic of Texas was the spark that lit the fuse. Mexico, which had never recognized Texas's independence, viewed this as an act of aggression. But the dispute went even further. The U.S. claimed the Rio Grande as the border of Texas, while Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, hundreds of miles to the north. This massive, disputed territory, along with the American desire for California and the Southwest, created a powder keg just waiting to explode. President James K. Polk, a staunch expansionist, saw a war with Mexico as the fastest way to achieve his vision of a coast-to-coast nation. He sent troops into the disputed zone, provoking a response from Mexican forces. When they clashed, Polk went to Congress and declared that American blood has been shed on American soil. The war had officially begun. But its true motivations were far more complex than a simple border dispute. One of the most shocking aspects of the war, often overlooked, is its staggering human cost. Battles like Buena Vista and Chapultepec are famous. The deadliest enemy wasn't the musket ball or the cannon. It was disease. For every American soldier killed in combat, roughly 7 died from illnesses like dysentery, yellow fever, and measles. The camps were unsanitary. Medical knowledge was limited, and the soldiers, many of whom were volunteers, unaccustomed to the climate, fell in droves. In total, the U.S. lost over 13,000 men, making it, proportionally, one of the deadliest conflicts in American history. Now, let's talk about one of the most fascinating and controversial figures of this era: Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. If you only know him from the Alamo, you're missing half the story. At the start of the war, Santa Anna was in exile in Cuba. In a masterful act of deception, he contacted President Polk and made an incredible offer. He promised that if the U.S. Navy helped him sneak back into Mexico, he would take power and sell the disputed territories to the United States for a reasonable price, ending the war quickly. Polk, eager for a swift conclusion, agreed and allowed him to pass through the American blockade. But Santa Anna had no intention of keeping his word. Once back in Mexico, he rallied public support, denounced any deal with the Americans, and took command of the Mexican army to fight against the very people who had helped him return. This incredible double-cross completely changed the dynamic of the war. Instead of a quick negotiation, the United States now faced a determined and unified Mexican resistance led by a cunning, charismatic general. Santa Anna's betrayal prolonged the conflict significantly, leading to many more months of brutal fighting and thousands more casualties on both sides. The Mexican-American War served as a crucial training ground for a generation of military officers who would later become household names during the American Civil War. Think of it as a dress rehearsal for the main event. On the same side, fighting for the U.S. Army, were future generals like Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, George Meade, and James Longstreet. Robert E. Lee, then a captain of engineers, distinguished himself with his brilliant reconnaissance skills, finding paths through difficult terrain that allowed American forces to outmaneuver the Mexican army. A young lieutenant named Ulysses S. Grant, though he personally opposed the war, observed military strategy and logistics firsthand. He later wrote in his memoirs about the valuable lessons he learned on leadership and supply lines. These officers learned how to command troops in battle, manage long supply chains, and adapt to unfamiliar territory. The tactics they developed, the relationships they forged, and the rivalries that began in the mountains and deserts of Mexico would all come to a head just over a decade later, shaping the course of America's bloodiest conflict. The war didn't just add territory to the U.S. It forged the leaders who would soon tear it apart and then piece it back together. So why does all this matter today? Because many of the misconceptions about the war's origins persist, and this affects how we understand our own history. Often, it's taught as a simple story. Mexico was the aggressor, and the U.S. was defending its territory. But, as we've seen, the reality is far more nuanced. The U.S. government, driven by manifest destiny, was arguably the provocateur, strategically placing troops in disputed land to initiate a conflict it knew it could win. Prominent figures at the time, like Abraham Lincoln, then a young congressman, and the writer Henry David Thoreau, openly questioned the war's morality. Thoreau was even jailed for refusing to pay a tax that would fund the war, leading him to write his famous essay, Civil Disobedience. Understanding that the war was a deliberate act of expansion, not just a defensive reaction, is crucial. It challenges the simplistic narrative of American exceptionalism and forces us to confront the more aggressive aspects of our nation's past. Acknowledging these complexities doesn't diminish American history. It enriches it, providing a more honest and complete picture of how the modern United States was formed. Finally, the lack of awareness about the Mexican-American War has created a huge blind spot in our understanding of modern U.S.-Mexico relations. For the United States, the war was a triumph that fulfilled its continental destiny. But for Mexico, it was a national trauma known as La Intervención Estadounidense, the American intervention. The country lost over half of its territory, including the lands that would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of several other states. This event left a deep and lasting scar on the Mexican national psyche, fostering a sense of suspicion and resentment toward its northern neighbor that has endured for generations. Every negotiation, every policy debate, every interaction between the two countries happens in the shadow of this history. When we in the U.S. fail to recognize the significance of this war from the Mexican perspective, we fail to grasp the historical context that underpins so many contemporary issues, from immigration and border security to trade and diplomacy. It's a shared history, but with two very different memories. Acknowledging the war as true nature is the first step toward a more empathetic and productive relationship between these two deeply intertwined nations. So there you have it. The Mexican-American War is far more than a footnote in a textbook. It was a brutal, complex conflict driven by ambition, shaped by betrayal, and with consequences that we are still living with today. It was a proving ground for Civil War generals and a defining moment in the story of American expansionism. More importantly, it created a historical divide between the U.S. and Mexico that can only be bridged through better understanding. Hopefully, this has given you a new perspective on a pivotal but often forgotten chapter of history. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this interesting and want to uncover more hidden histories, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next video. Let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like me to cover. See you next time.